This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Scenic Hudson and Thorin Designs. Thorin, there's something in the water.
Don't go in the water, or do.
Yeah. Who's our guest today?
We've got Nat Benchley is coming into the studio, and he is the brother of Peter Benchley, who wrote, amongst other things, Jaws. And this year is the 50th anniversary of the book. So it's a big year for the Benchley family. But I hope that Nat will also speak to us a little bit about his entire family, speaking of family, and share insights into their familial Moxie and his brother's journey, his own journey. And I'm just excited to learn so much about the Benchley family and the trajectory of, for his brother, the impact he's had on society and sharks in particular.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So let's dive in. Scenic Hudson, collaborating to love, protect, and connect people, communities, and nature since 1963. There's more to explore. www.scenichudson.org.
Nat, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to talk about this.
So the question of how would you define Moxie, you can take it as how would you define it? How would your brother define it? How would your family define it?
I wouldn't want to speak for him. Certainly, he's got other people speaking for him. But I will tell you, having grown up in New York City, you say Moxie to me, and other than the soft drink,
right,
what I think of is chutzpah. Mm-hmm. It's nerve. It's the willingness to do something offbeat, out of your wheelhouse. Sometimes it's forced on you. Sometimes you choose to go out and jump into it. But having Moxie, I've always thought of as a good thing.
Okay, yeah. And your family has had it in spades through generations.
3, actually.
Yeah.
They have. And some of it was forced on them or just came to them. It started with my grandfather, who really didn't have much of a plan in life. And then suddenly fame was thrust upon him and carried him away for a good 25 years. And my father had more of a sense of what he was getting into because his father had been a freelance writer. And his father had always said to him, you really want to do this? That's a terrible life. And he did. He had some help from his landlord and dear friend, John Steinbeck, who said to him in the late 40s, you should be a writer on your own. He was working for Newsweek at the time. Mm-hmm. And John said, you really don't want to do this. You've got too many ideas. You want to be a writer. And but he said, don't quit because you're about to be fired. So take what they give you in severance and start your freelance career. And they remained friends for 20 years until John's death. But John also mentored Peter a bit.
Okay, your brother.
When they met after the war, after Second World War, my father came home. He had been in California preparing to invade Japan with a few other American soldiers. And VJ Day happened, and it took him a month or so to get home because the trains were so crowded.
Right.
He arrived home in New York the day after his father had died. So there was a whole bleak period for the family in September of 1945. And then my mother got quickly pregnant with a second child, which would be me. And they were introduced to John and Gwen Steinbeck, who had 2 absolutely gorgeous townhouses on East 78th Street in New York. They were side by side. They shared a common backyard, and they were a basement and 4 stories. Just lovely houses. And John rented one of them to my parents because he and his wife had a 4-year-old son. My parents had a 6-year-old son, and both wives were pregnant. So we started out in 1946 there with them. And John and my father became fast friends. And then when he and Gwen divorced in 49, we had to move out of those lovely houses, but stayed in New York. And by then my father had gone freelance. And I have to say that more and more these days, I have been freelance for 45, 50 years. I marvel at how my father, as a freelance writer, put 2 kids through private school, Exeter and Choate, and 2 colleges, Stanford and Harvard, and managed to buy a house in Nantucket. I mean, the fact that he was such a dedicated writer helped because he was always writing something. If he finished a book, he would instantly turn over and do a magazine article or a children's book or something else. He just kept doing it, and his output was amazing. But it amazes me how he managed to scrape all that together. Because those were not, and particularly are still not, cheap schools, any of them.
No, not at all.
And buying a house in Nantucket in those days, in the early 50s, was a bit easier. Right now, you couldn't touch it. The house was bought in 1954 for $25,000. It was sold in 1978 to Peter for $250,000. And I believe it was sold in 1999 for a couple of million.
Right.
I mean, that's just the way Nantucket has gone, which is insanity. Anyway.
A shark to bring prices down.
Doesn't seem to keep the people away. Anyway, so my father understood what it meant to be a freelancer. And when he detected in Peter the inklings that he might want to write, because John Steinbeck was encouraging him, and my father tested him when he was 15 years old and said, I will pay you what you would make as a landscape assistant or whatever the jobs were we did in Nantucket, to sit down at the typewriter and write 1,000 words a day and see if you like the discipline. And he thought that the 15-year-old would say, to heck with this, I'm going to the beach. And Peter loved it. And he did it for 2 summers in a row and really honed his craft as a writer. And that's what stood him in such good stead because, again, after college, he had a couple of jobs. He pretty quickly had children. He had his first child in Washington when he was working for Lyndon Johnson. But that employment came to an abrupt end on January 20th, 1969, when Richard Nixon's people took over.
Right.
And Peter's office was shuttered, and he and Wendy and their tiny child moved to New Jersey. But he had no job, no nothing, except the skills that he had honed. He knew he was a writer. He had worked as a reporter for the Washington Post. He had worked as a columnist for Newsweek. So again, he had been working on the various aspects of being a professional writer.
Right.
And he was struggling working odd jobs as a freelancer. He did some on-camera work in New York on television and did some freelance articles for the Geographic and some others. And finally, an editor said to him, he talked to a bunch of editors about his possibilities for novels. And none of them thought them terribly exciting, or certainly not worth putting any money down on. And he finally met a man from Doubleday named Tom Congdon, who took him to lunch and said, you got any ideas for novels? And Peter said, well, I got this one about modern-day pirates of the Caribbean. And Tom said, yeah, I don't think so. And he said, well, there is this one story about a great white shark that harasses a beachfront community. And as Peter admitted, and Wendy admitted, she didn't think much of that idea either. But Tom Congdon said, well, that might work. So they gave him $1,000 advance to produce 4 chapters in 1971. And the advance quickly went away, and the 4 chapters weren't forthcoming. And Doubleday called and said, excuse me, you owe us either some writing or some chapters or some money.
Right.
Peter said, I haven't got any money, so I'll do some writing for you. And quickly sat down and ripped off 4 chapters. And the interesting thing, and this is a long-standing quest of Wendy's and mine, apparently Tom Congdon said, well, this is cute, but it's wrong. I mean, you've written a funny adventure story. And as Peter later said, the idea of trying to do a comedy about a shark eating people is a perfect oxymoron.
Right.
So fortunately, Tom didn't pull the plug. He said, go home and do this right.
Right.
And Peter did. He focused on it and made it an adventure story and turned in the 4 chapters. And they said, yeah, that'll do. And he spent another year and a half or so working on it. And when they sent the salespeople out, I think they only sent them out with the first 6 pages of the book. And they sold it to everybody, book clubs, everybody bit just based on the first 6 pages. And then that's when Peter and Wendy's life turned around. And she admitted, she said, when the first revenue from the book came in and they realized what was happening, she burst into tears because she said, my life is never going to be the same again. And she was right. But they also had no idea what was going to happen the next year because Peter, in his infinite wisdom as a writer, knowing very little about the movie business, except my father's bad experience. My father had several books bought and adapted to movies, and most of the movies were just garbage, except when they bought The Off Islanders, and a man named Norman Jewison optioned it, and my father had no idea who he was. So they said, do you want to share the movie, which in those days was still viable till about the late 70s, or do you want just a flat fee? And my father didn't trust Hollywood. So he said, well, I'll take your fee. And then they cranked out this little movie called The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. So Peter had mixed emotions about all of that. And when his agent said, film producers are interested in optioning this book, and Peter said, for what? You can't make a movie out of this. You can't train a great white shark, and there's not the technology around to make a mechanical one. And his agent said, well, that may be true, but sell them the rights anyway. They're willing to pay for it. So even if the movie doesn't get made, you get something out of it. Peter said, fine. And then the agent came back and said, oh, and they want the rights to sequels too. He said, sequels? What sequels? Can't make sequels to a movie you can't make. So once again, he was proved 180 degrees wrong, and everything exploded. And there were bad and there were good effects afterwards, obviously. The movie was so popular and it made so many people afraid of sharks that there was this mania for several years in the late 70s of people going out and feeling they had to kill sharks. And they were dynamiting them and finning them and gutting them. And it was awful. And first of all, Peter and Wendy realized that was wrong and had to stop. But they also, in about 75 or 6, I think, he was invited by ABC to go to Australia and do a cage dive. And he had written this book based on all the best science that everybody knew in the late 60s, early 70s. But it was spotty. And the science he used was perfectly good at the time, but he'd never seen a great white shark up close. We had seen them in Nantucket when we used to go fishing with our father. And I have to say, I still remember being on a secure boat, feeling perfectly safe, seeing that fin go through the water right next to the boat. It's eerie. Yeah. And that was just a 6 or 8 foot blue shark or a mako. But when Peter went diving for the first time with great whites and saw them in action, he was gobsmacked. And he came up from that dive and said, I've been wrong. We have to do something to preserve these great creatures because we cannot make them the villain anymore. And then the more research he did with brilliant scientists and oceanographers and filmmakers over the next certainly 10 years, the more he learned and said, we've really got to stop this and turn people around. And so since the mid-70s, Peter for 30 years and Wendy now for almost 50 have been working to preserve sharks, preserve the ocean ecology. Wendy's been very instrumental in getting countries to ban shark finning, which is a really odious process where people literally mutilate and kill a shark just for the fins to put it in some tasteless soup. And Wendy enlisted a lot of her scientific friends and the basketball star Yao Ming, because China is one of the greatest offenders in the shark finning world. And they've gotten a lot of countries to put bans on finning. So there's progress to be made. She's still continually working at this. But that was where there was a whole switch, a whole flip to Peter's and Wendy's life that I think it was very courageous of him to stand up and say, I was wrong. You cannot, he said many times he couldn't write the book again. He couldn't make the shark a villain. And a couple of people have tried to do sequels or sort of follow-up books where the shark isn't a villain, but it certainly lacks something in the adventure part of it.
Right, that man against beast.
Right. And that was fine at the time, but it's hard now to vilify one particular beast that's just doing what it does.
Right.
And as you know, as one of the things I saw recently said, don't say the waters are shark infested. They live there.
Right.
We're intruding.
That's their habitat.
So putting a human spin on something where it shouldn't be.
I saw the film, so I was 11 when it came out, and I saw it babysitting when I was probably like 15. Because probably when it came out in the theaters, if it was condemned by the Long Island Catholic weekly newspaper
For violence?
then I was not allowed to see that kind of movie. So I probably saw it surreptitiously at a babysitting job. I was petrified. I wasn't close to the water. I was in a room. And I just finished reading the book yesterday.
Mhm.
And that discussion about intentionality in a shark and the predatory, that the shark is just doing what it's doing. But this shark, by the end, Quint and Hooper seem to feel like there's something going on here. Like this shark is following us. This shark is outsmarting us. And it seemed to flip a little bit into this shark that had evolved into something a little more intentional. I don't know if you...
Well, it did. I wouldn't, again, I think you put too much human intention on what the shark is doing. But yeah, I think they had, by that time, aggravated the shark enough.
Yeah.
And, one of the other things Peter learned fairly quickly was that the theory he had in the book called the rogue shark theory has been discredited many times since.
Okay.
And some of the other things they thought about sharks at the time have since been proven wrong. But one of the great outcomes of this is the number of people who now study. I mean, we have a friend named Greg Stone who became an oceanographer because of Jaws. And he now has a PhD, and he goes all over the world trying to save coral reefs and sharks. And,
Wow.
but once Peter saw all the damage that was being done, he knew we had to change people's minds about this.
So it was a galvanizer.
It was a fortuitous, if somewhat costly, event because there were a lot of sharks slaughtered.
Yeah.
The populations are coming back now, and as we see, particularly off San Francisco and off Cape Cod, when you protect the seal population, the shark population comes right along behind it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what's exploded on the Cape. But again, the nice thing is there are now entire organizations devoted to tracking and studying the sharks. And they have websites. You can follow them, both one for the East Coast, one for the West. And there are a lot of people doing very serious work about this. There are still, obviously, incidents. Recently, there were a couple in Florida, I think.
Yeah, I think there were 3 on the
Was
same
it
day.
in Florida? Yeah. Because people insist on going into waters where, the sharks are. But that's a nice piece of outcome. Basically, they are doing a lot to save the shark population, and people are just going to have to get used to it.
Right. Well, you're risking it by going in the water where they live.
Yeah. I mean, I have a friend who won't go in the water anywhere still, and I do. The only beach, unfortunately, we get to go to these days is off the Jersey shore, but I get near the water, I have to go in it.
Yeah.
I get out with friends, and they sit on the beach all day, and I can't do that. I have to go in, whether there's surf or not.
Right.
Last year, we were down the Jersey shore, and they cleared the beach one day because there was apparently a flock of manta rays moving through. And I never saw them, but the lifeguards did, and the spotters did, and they watched them move through and then said, okay, the beaches are open now again. But yeah, there has been a lot of nice outcome after struggle for the 70s and 80s.
The aftermath of the book seemed to have changed his trajectory away from writing thrillers and novels toward this advocacy work.
Well, he did both because he wrote his second book was one of my favorites. It's called The Deep. And again, Peter was brilliant at taking a fact, absolute fact, and saying, but what if? There was a fact, there was a shark off Long Island. He said, but what if it stayed around? In Bermuda, there are hundreds of shipwrecks because Bermuda is the top of an undersea volcano. So it is a volcano rising up out of the water, and it is ringed with coral reefs. And for many years, the reefs were not charted, so ships went up on them, cracked up, sank. And what usually happens is when a ship is breaking up on the reef, the water and the tide will push it into a hole, a sand hole, between the reefs. And over time, it will sink down. And there is a place in Bermuda where there are 3 ships stacked on top of each other from the 16th, 18th, and 20th centuries.
Oh, wow.
Peter said, well, that's a bit much. How about if it's just 2? And we have one ship that went down in the 18th century full of gold, and one ship that went down in the 20th century, which is true, full of morphine and drugs. And they're right on top of each other. And so he blew this up into a story of some vacationers, honeymooners, who discover some of the drugs, and word gets out, and drug dealers on Bermuda want it and want them to tell them where they found it. And in so doing, digging for the drugs, they uncover the gold that's on the ship underneath. And it's a wonderful adventure story. It was made into a really good movie, once again with Robert Shaw, but Nick Nolte and Jacqueline Bisset. And I just love it. It's very exciting. And then Peter wrote The Island, the pirate story he had wanted to write. Was less successful. Still, it was made into a movie with Michael Caine. And he kept doing these adventure stories. And then he got to do what he really wanted to do, which was a story about the ocean, the ecology, the environment, and protecting it. And it was called The Girl of the Sea of Cortez, once again based on fact. He had been on a diving expedition in the Sea of Cortez. They'd gone down to see hammerhead sharks gathering and also manta rays. And at one point when the film crew and Peter were all underwater shooting something, one of the crew, one of the assistant camera people, was on deck, and a manta ray came up and floated right near the boat. And Michelle saw that it had wire. And so she put on a snorkel and fins and took her knife with her, went overboard quietly, and went and cut the wire off the fishing line and the hook, took it off the manta ray. Manta ray went away. She got back on the boat and told the guys when they came up what had happened. The manta ray came back.
Wow.
And Peter got in the water with it and rode it like a sled. And there's film of him riding this thing. It has to be 15 feet across. And he's holding onto the front of it like this, riding it just like a sled through the water.
Wow.
And the manta ray stayed around for a couple of days and let several people ride it. So Peter was absolutely stunned by this experience and literally instantly came home and wrote a book about a young Mexican girl who lives on the Sea of Cortez and her brother who's a fisherman and who likes to fish illegally and use dynamite and do all kinds of dangerous things. But she discovers this manta ray, and eventually her brother browbeats her into showing him where it is. And it's a lovely story, but it's not full of adventure and blood and gore. Didn't sell terribly well, but it was Peter's really heartfelt book. And his publisher said to him, well, that's nice, but let's get back to the adventure stuff.
Yeah.
So then he wrote a couple more, one fantastical one about the Germans during World War II supposedly doing research, trying to create a man who could exist underwater. So they'd created a half man, half shark. And it was in a submarine on its way to somewhere, and the sub sank, and they lost it. And so then 40 years later, it cropped up. It was terrorizing people. He also wrote a wonderful one about a giant squid, which in those days was more imagination than fact, and has since been proven true. There are out there giant squid, up to 50 and 60 feet long, with eyeballs the size of dinner plates, and suckers that you see sperm whales that have a mark on them the size of a dinner plate where one sucker from a squid has grabbed on and ripped the skin off, ripped the flesh off. So Peter kept writing the adventure books and at the same time doing the ecology work and giving speeches and donating his time to narrate films for the New England Aquarium and other organizations to try and preserve the ecology. So he was busy on both ends at the time. And I don't know how he maintained it, honestly, because he was also at the time in a great deal of pain in his neck from some accidents and some bad posture. And he still managed to crank out an awful lot of work, like my grandfather, who made a living as what the French call a flâneur, a person who never does anything. He is an idler. He can't be browbeaten into doing anything. And my grandfather's whole reputation was as such. And yet he wrote articles, made movies started the first talking film in 1929. Between then and 1945, he made, I've lost track, 40-some short films and 30-some features while doing columns for Life magazine, The New Yorker, and other magazines, and while having his own radio show for 3 years, variety show.
And this is Robert Benchley.
That's Robert. And he had, as I say, his whole character was of an idler who didn't do anything. And he produced a dozen published books of short stories and another couple thousand that didn't get published and all this other work. But I don't know, he had this wonderful way of pretending to be absolutely lazy and do nothing. And he was prolific. And part of the thing is, I think that he was such a good writer, his work didn't need a lot of editing. So he would write it down and boom, it would go in the magazine. That's if he got it done. A copy boy from the New Yorker showed up once at his hotel suite in New York and said, "Mr. Benchley, this article is overdue." And he said, right, okay, I'll write. Oh, it's over here, it's finished. And he put it in an envelope and handed it to him. What he handed him was an article he'd done for another magazine. And while the editors were figuring this out, he sat down and wrote the one that was due.
He said, "Oh, I gave you the wrong one."
Exactly. And he said, "My secretary gave you the wrong one."
Yeah.
So he kept cranking it out. And then things began to snowball, particularly during the Depression and the Second World War. People were ravenous for funny stuff to distract them.
Right.
And he kept cranking it out. And the movies were so popular, he actually won an Oscar for one of them, that in the later years, the late 30s, early 40s, the producers were allowing him to redo stuff he'd done 10, 15 years earlier because they just needed more new product.
That Algonquin Circle, I've heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. But he was part of that.
He was indeed. It was a funny thing. It started in 1919 as a tribute to Alexander Wolcott, who was one of the members and who had been boring people to tears with tales of his expeditions during the Great War, not yet numbered World War I because we didn't know there'd be a two. But during the Great War, he was indeed in combat in Europe. But he came back and bored people to tears with his story. So a bunch of them decided one day to throw him a tribute lunch, what we would call these days a roast. And they had this little lunch, and they all got up and told wild stories and abused Alec. And he loved it so much, because the attention was all on him, he said, "Well, let's do this again." And they began meeting for lunch just about every day. And again, I don't understand how this happened, because they would generally meet for lunch, then go off and do a little bit of work, then come back at happy hour, and then maybe go to dinner someplace or go to the theater and then play poker. My grandfather would stay up till 1 or 2 and 3 in the morning. He at times would drag my father with him to go up. His favorite place in New York to sort of chill out at the end of the day was right across from Grant's tomb. The largest mausoleum in the country is a little tiny plot. It's about 6 feet by 4 feet with a headstone in it that says, "In honor of an amiable child taken in the 5th year of his life." And my grandfather used to love to go and stand and stare at the amiable child gravestone and look across at the Palisades in New Jersey. And it just helped chill him out at the end of the day. But his schedule was nuts. And yet he managed to produce work. Not always on time, and he also, for 10 years, he was the theater critic for Life, when it was more of a writing magazine than a picture magazine. And then for 10 years, he was the theater critic for The New Yorker. And that meant he was going to the theater just about every night. And in New York in those days, there were, I think, 42 theaters showing plays. And he had to go and review them all. And Life at the time had a column, the name of which will come to me eventually. Every week it would be a compendium of his reviews. So it would say, "At the Broadhurst Theater, this play," and he would give a one-line summary of the play. And it was a full 2-page spread with all these reviews. And one of them opened up, and he absolutely hated it. It was a silly piece of garbage called A.B.'s Irish Rose. And these days you couldn't produce it because it would be considered offensive to at least 2 ethnicities, if not more. It's about a Jew named A.B. who marries his wild Irish Rose. And hilarity ensues, according to some people. But it opened, and Robert gave it a scathing review and said, "Well, that's enough of that." And it kept going, and people liked it. And every week he had to write a new review of it for this column. And he started running out of bad things to say. And it became a game for New Yorkers to open to this column to see what Benchley had to say about A.B.'s Irish Rose this week. And after 4 years or so, he would say things like, "Will the Marines never come?" Or, "The fact that this play is still running accounts for the number of shaved necks you see on the streets." And all kinds of weird stuff. And finally, he got really tired after 5 years of this. In the column, you opened it up, and this particular week it said, "AB's Irish Rose, see Hebrews 13:8. Okay, well, for the people who took the time to go to their Old Testament, Hebrews 13:8, the entire citation is Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. And among the many things that I questioned when I was doing my research on him was, where did he find that? It's the perfect quote.
Yeah.
And it turns out that during college, one year, he was forced to conduct a Bible study seminar by a member of the football team who was a very devout Bible thumper and offered to thump Robert if he didn't conduct the class. And this went on for a while. So he had to do some studying. But then he got in a little trouble when he put out a notice saying, "Bible study class, Thornton Hall, Thursday, 5:30 p.m., nickel ante." And the football player didn't think that was particularly funny. But it turns out Robert, once again, had done a lot of research and had found the perfect quote. When I was researching him, I found a piece from before he was famous, long before, that he wrote for the New York Herald, I believe, or the Herald Tribune, about comparing Shakespeare and Charlie Chaplin. And it's a brilliant piece. And it isn't really even terribly offbeat. He found in later years he couldn't write serious pieces much because he'd always go off on a tangent and throw in something funny and never get back to the main theme. He was beginning to develop this sense of humor, which caught fire after the Great War, because this country had beaten back the Hun and felt invincible, and people were willing for anything they considered funny, offbeat, whatever. And he struck a nerve with that.
Thorin Designs knows your next big marketing idea could be huge for your business and its future. Talk to them about your business's design and marketing needs. They're here to help with graphic design, branding, book design, websites, social media, and more. You can find them at www.thorindesigns.com or follow them on Instagram and Facebook at Thorin Designs.
Okay, you're talking about the Algonquin Roundtable Group. They decided in 1922, I think, to put on a review. They were parodying some of the reviews on Broadway. And they asked Robert for some ideas for sketches. And he said, sure. And a couple of weeks later, the entertainment committee asked him to come in and give them his ideas for sketches. And he didn't have any. He hadn't done any of it. So he showed up at the meeting with an envelope on the back of which he'd scribbled some notes. And he stood up in the meeting and pretended to be the treasurer of the association, delivering the annual financial report. And again, wandering off on tangents, getting things wrong, making outrageous statements about the finances. And the committee said afterwards, "So I gather you don't have any ideas for sketches." He said, "Oh, did it show?" And they said, "Why don't you take that little piece you did and develop it?" So he developed it, and they put it in the review, which only ran for 3 nights. And it was so popular that Broadway producers came to him. Irving Berlin and his partner, Sam Harris, came to him and said, "We'd like you to do this little treasurer's report of yours in our 3rd Music Box review." And Robert said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly. I'm a theater critic. I can't appear on stage. And aside from which, I have to get to the theater." And they said, "We'll work it out so you can do your bit and then go off and review whatever play it is." And he said, "No, I can't do that." And they offered him some money. He said, "No, I can't do that." And finally, they said, "Well, look, during the Depression, we will give you $500 a week to do this." And he said, "You're out of your minds, but yes, I'll do it." And then, of course, Irving Berlin turned to him and said, "And for that, you better be funny." And he was, but it weighed on him because it was repetition. And he got so tired of it he did it 8 shows a week for 7 years.
Wow.
And he did it at speeches and conventions, and people would pay him to do a ripoff of it. I mean, I've done it. You take an organization, my introduction up here was for the Sharon Historical Society. And I did a version of the Treasurer's Report, and I just took the name of their treasurer and inserted it into the piece. And people loved it. But after 7 years, he said, that's it. So when somebody from Fox Movies came to him and said, look, we're experimenting with this little thing called talking pictures. And I understand you have some short material. We have a 10-minute window. One reel of film was 10 minutes. It was called a one reel wonder. And he said, well, if I record this Treasurer's Report, if the sound even sticks to the film, maybe I'll never have to do it again. And he recorded it in New York at Astoria and went to see it on film and said, oh, man, this is, no, this talking picture thing will never work. Everybody back to the live theater. But they rather liked it, and they said, have you got anything else? He said, you're crazy. Okay, sure. And he took two of his pieces, two of my favorites, called The Sex Life of the Newt and The Social Life of the Newt and The Sex Life of the Polyp, and produced a lecture that to me is still hysterical because it's him, very prudish, uptight, at a woman's luncheon, explaining the sex life of this subatomic amoebic polyp and talking about sex and things like that and reproduction and these biddies, these old Margaret Dumont type biddies sitting there looking at him. It's a hysterical piece. And again, it fits right in with his style because he talks about that the polyps can decide whether they want to be male or female depending on whatever whim hits them that day. Then he goes through a whole long experiment that he and Dr. Rassiter did. And finally at the end says, well, our male polyp, unable to excite the button we put in place or the crumb of cornbread, finally gave up the whole thing as a bad job and turned back into a female, which left us where we were when we started with no male at all. And that was the beginning of a long ride of 48 shorts, I think it was.
I saw one this morning on how to fall asleep.
Oh, How to Sleep.
How to Sleep.
That's the one that won an Academy Award, believe it or not.
I was laughing out loud.
And
as he's rummaging through the fridge while the milk is on the boil.
Right, and the sheep were dancing over his head. That one, interestingly, I'd never understood this. He wrote it, and it was intended for another comic whose name may or may not come to me.
Yeah.
Who got sick.
Yeah.
And so the producers, not, again, typical producers, cast about, said, well, who could we get? Who could do this instead of whoever the intended one was? And they said, I don't know. Well, let's see if Bob can do it. Bob had already done about a dozen of them. So he sleepwalked his way through it, and it won an Academy Award for Best Short.
Wow. So this is the environment, the multi-generational environment that you and your brother were inhabiting with these very creative, kind of maverick role models.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I was growing up in New York, Robert's aura was all around, and obviously there were clubs my father would go to.
And was he alive?
No, my grandfather died a year before I was born.
Okay.
A month before I was conceived, actually. But his aura was still everywhere, in the theater and film. And I went once with a friend to the theater. We'd reserved tickets, and I picked them up at the box office, said 2 for Benchley. As I was walking in, the doorman at the theater said, Benchley, any relation to... And I said, yes, he's my grandfather. He said, oh, God, I love his work. I worked with him a couple of times at the theater. Give him my regards. And I thought, well, you haven't been reading the paper much. He's been dead for 13 years. But yeah, I will indeed. Thank you very much. And it was nice for a while. Then it got to be a bit much. But yes, there was always this aura of, well, and the people my father hung out with, actors and writers, were just fascinating people.
And did it feel at times pressure-filled that you had to live up to something, or that Peter had to live up to something?
That's where being the second child takes that pressure off.
Yes.
Because Peter was the one who excelled as a student and an athlete and this or that and the other. So I think expectations were probably high for him. My father used to take him out a lot, and they had a lot of heart-to-hearts, usually at 21 over several drinks. I don't know what went on there, but it obviously helped compel Peter to produce and to work hard. When I came along, again, with the second child syndrome, it was obvious I wasn't going to be as successful, as bright, as hardworking as Peter. So apparently I decided subconsciously that the way to get attention was to make noise and to do outrageous things. So I spent a lot of years irritating and agitating. And my father and I had a real knockheads for a good long while because there was that shining example going ahead of me, and I was just plodding along. And to be honest, I was testing in school on the 95th percentile and getting C's. So it was obvious I wasn't paying much attention or living up to any potential. And that went along for quite a while until it came time to get serious and go to boarding school. And I had to actually do some work and earn the entry. And the same thing with college. By my junior year, I'd been fiddling around at Choate for so long. My parents sat me down once and said, look, we'd love you to go to college. We don't think you're going to get into anything good, but we'd love if you went to college. Just do something. That was where their opinion of me was, justifiably so. So for whatever reason, it pushed a switch in me. And I actually sat down and did some work and got accepted at 4 fairly good colleges. And once again, with typical lack of thinking, picked the college to go to because it was the farthest away from home.
So in the book Jaws, a lot of what Thorne and I were talking about that we found interesting was the social commentary and the ethical aspects of, like, I feel like Peter spent a lot of time on drawing attention to privilege and the summer community versus the year-rounders and that tension of the us and the them. And then also this ethical dilemma that Chief Brody is placed in of the economic interests of a town that needs this and what is the right thing to do. And I found that to be one of the, along with the shark stuff, to be an interesting aspect of the book, that capitalist examination of how the right thing falls victim to what is financially.
Yeah. Well, again, Peter, we grew up in Nantucket when it was a viable, charming community, and you could go fishing 30 miles offshore for swordfish or whatever you wanted. And people understood, Peter understood certainly, the economics that Nantucket exists off its income for May, June, July, August, and now September. In the winter up there, nobody makes any money. It's bleak. The main occupation is alcoholism. The population has grown, certainly, and the season has extended a bit because the summer folk like to come back for the Christmas walk and something around Thanksgiving. But the economics of the island haven't changed much. And he absorbed that. He was smart enough and attentive enough. And my father made a living off of parodying small towns like this. He wrote some books that were so clever. There was one about a winter theater group on an island like this, or a community like this. And he parodied some of the people on the island so cleverly that they didn't know they'd been had. So,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, just so Peter would learn from him the way to see the overall picture of a community like this. And again, his what if, his brilliant novelist's what if, sat up and said, but what if the main source of their income was cut off? What would they do?
Right. I feel like there was empathy for the small, like I didn't feel that he was parodying the small town. I felt like he was parodying the privileged.
Right.
When he talks about the teenagers and what they're bred for, and the girls smell like perfume and the boys smell clean, and that anything that happens in the world won't touch them.
Well, there's a tiny bit of that in the movie. You see in the second scene after Chrissy has been devoured, when the sheriff is walking along with the kid, and he's talking about, he's an islander, but he wasn't born here, but he grew up here, and he's talking about all the kind of stuff the privileged people do. They show up for the summer and have a nice house. Peter understood all that. He was very much in sympathy with the islanders. My father did a piece in 1976 for the Today Show, and they were doing one state a month leading up to the bicentennial. So they obviously started in early 75. And they asked my father to do a piece for the Nantucket, the Massachusetts segment. And he wrote a lovely piece explaining the island, its charms, its history. And he said at one point, I am not an islander. I first started coming here in the 1920s with my family. My wife and I moved here full-time in 1969. Our children were raised part-time here, but I'm not considered an islander. I'm a summer person who decided to stay. Mm. He said, nothing short of reincarnation could make me an islander. You have to have been born there. And for a long time, what we call the old folks home, the retirement home on Nantucket, only accepted people who were born on the island. Oh. That has since changed of necessity. But they very much understood. I mean, my parents, after 1969, lived there year-round. So they saw firsthand what it was like in the bleak of winter, as did I. I mean, I had to go up and visit them usually around Christmas, and I mean, it is, a rock in the middle of the ocean. It is bleak. It is cold. There's nothing to do. It's about 3 hours of sunlight. So if you're a writer, that's great. You go off into your workshop. And my mother for years worked at the hospital. Then that ended, and she struggled to find other things to do to interest her.
Was any part of the book autobiographical, pieces of people? Could you see a bit of Peter and Hooper because his interest in sharks, or I don't even know.
I wouldn't impute that to him. I mean, certainly there was in The Deep and The Island, there was more autobiographical stuff because the main character in The Island is a magazine reporter who is sent off to investigate reports of piracy and ships disappearing. I wouldn't think that in Jaws itself, Peter had much of himself because he hadn't yet attained when he wrote that. He just barely qualified in scuba. So he was hardly an underwater expert. So,
but was he interested in sharks before the book?
Oh, a long time, yeah. I mean, as kids, he has said, he even admitted that when he and I and our father used to go out, our father had a boat. We used to charter boats from native Nantucketers, Gibby Nickerson mostly, who had a boat called a Flicka. We'd go out for half a day or a day, go 30 miles offshore, and you could catch sometimes swordfish or big blues, and sometimes sharks. And I hate to admit that in the 50s, we caught a couple of sharks just as trophies, cut them up, threw the carcasses away, saved the jaws. And that was long before anybody really thought much about ecology. And we always thought the ocean was an always replenishing resource.
Right.
And until the 70s and 80s, when people began killing indiscriminately, it was. But now they've killed it so fast, some of the stuff can't come back. Mm-hmm. But yes, as a teenager, both of us were interested. And as I said, seeing the fin in the water, even from a boat, is chilling. So Peter turned his imagination loose, and he kept an eye out for things. He had literally a news clipping in his wallet about a shark that was caught off Long Island, off Montauk, 4,500 pounds. And he thought, wow, what if? Mm-hmm. And that was, in those days, that was rare to have a shark around there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he sat on that idea for, 5 or 6 years.
That was another interesting, towards the end of the book. Hopefully, anybody who's read it has read it, because it's going to be a spoiler. No, hopefully more people read it. When Quint and Hooper are going back and forth, and Hooper about the baby porpoise, and Quint saying those rules are not made for me. They're made for the people who are doing mass killing. But this is to support me. So conservation can't apply because this is how I make my living.
Well, and he also considered himself just a monster fisherman. He only went after specific trophies. He didn't clean up 400 blues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting tension between the economic needs of Quint to support himself and then conservation serving a larger agenda.
Well, and we understood, because my parents spent so much time up there. We had a lot of friends who were natives, and many of them ran shops up there. And one of them ran a clothing store that used to sell a lot of practical clothes, khakis and jeans, and then he started getting into a lot of designer stuff. But people up there would have, in those days, a lot of summer folk would have an account, a house account. So the kids could walk in and say, put it on my account. And at the end of the summer, families would go back to New York or Boston or wherever, Washington, in a big contingent. And Phil would send them bills every month with interest. They'd all chuck them away, and they would pay them when they came back in May. They'd pay them just before the next summer. And he admitted to my father once that he and his wife went to Europe every year on the interest alone from those bills that people didn't bother to pay until May. So they'd let it accrue from September to May. And then the interest stacked up.
God, when two worlds collide.
Yeah. And one of the others, my father loved to tell, there was a guy up there, one of the other Murrays, ran a liquor store. And he was very conscientious about what he bought, but he also had a fairly thick Nantucket accent. So he would say to my father, Nat, I got this great Polyfoos. I think you'll really like this one. And we got a Mont Ratchet in. And we got a Hot Brian I think you'll like.
But there is an element, I feel like it's not autobiographical, but he was writing what he knew, because there's a scene where Ellen's having people over for dinner and Brody is butchering the name of the wine.
Yeah, I mean, Peter absorbed this kind of stuff. And it's one of the things my father helped either teach him or just inculcate in him was observation.
Yeah.
I was never going to be a writer. My father tried at one point to see if I wanted to do some writing, and I was always more interested in performing.
Right.
So I would pick up accents and dialects and character traits that I could use on stage. But Peter was very much more into absorbing the atmosphere of a town or an island.
We're at that time.
Already?
We
Really?
are.
Wow.
We're well into that time.
Did I miss anything you wanted to talk about?
No, not at all. That was wide-ranging and wonderful to get a full picture of a time.
If you don't mind, there is a quote, and you can do what you want with this, but it's a quote that Peter loved, discovered in his later years, from a man named Henry Beston. It summed up Peter's attitude about the oceans and how we should interact with them. And the Beston quote from a book called The Outermost House, A Year in the Life of the Great Beach of Cape Cod, says, we need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate, for having taken form so far below ourselves, and therein do we err. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move, finished and complete, gifted with the extension of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth.
Amen.
And, if people would start looking at them that way and stop looking down at them. I mean, as Peter said, I don't know how you look down on a creature that for 4 million years has never had to evolve.
Yeah.
Because it's so perfect. All it does is swim and eat and make little sharks.
So what do you think, Peter, you or your family what kind of advice would you give someone to help them develop a little more Moxie or a little more renegade spirit?
I think you have to have, there are two theories. Actors always talk about two theories. One is don't have any backup plan.
That could do it.
I like
if the
that.
only thing you know is acting, you got to do it, and you got to find a way to do it. The other is you can protect yourself, but I don't think you find the commitment to it if you're doing something else as a backup. I was lucky. I went freelance. I had a job, actually, for years with public television. And I broke off in 1978 because I had enough writing contracting work to carry me through for a year. And I began to get into doing voiceovers and acting and found that was even more pleasant and less troublesome than having to sit down at the typewriter. And I was lucky. The work began to flow, and I was doubly lucky that this was a time when unions were fairly strong. And I joined 3 of them, and they forced me to put aside some money for a health plan and a retirement plan, which I never would have done myself. By the time I retired, I had pensions from 3 plans and medical coverage that continues. So I was lucky that I got to do just that for years. I did some writing on the side because I enjoyed it, but I was never forced to. I think if you find something you want to do, and these days it's apparently even more important to find something you really want to commit to, because kids coming out of high school and college are sort of forced to say, what's your direction? What is it you want to do?
Right.
And you have to identify that long before I ever had to. And you have to stick with it and really commit. And these days, there are a lot of resources to do that. But if you can identify something that fascinates you, as many people have said, you don't work a day in your life if it's all fun.
Right.
But you really have to commit to it. We had some people in Washington, as I was on the board of the Screen Actors Guild, who would, what I would say, fiddle fart around. And I said to them, it's not going to work. You have to treat it as a business, keep track of your records, and commit to it and go out and chase it. Otherwise, it's just a dilettantish fooling around.
Right.
But the people at the top of our chart were committed to it and were very good at it. And they found they could make a lot of money as well as having fun.
So the commitment has to be there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, otherwise you really are just clowning around and you're going to go nowhere. But if you can develop some moxie and stick it to your business, it should lead to success.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and talking about Jaws and
Your
the life
family.
of your family
Your
and your
legacy.
own career. This has been wonderful.
Well, it was an interesting ride, and I'm glad you've talked about it. Thank you for asking me.
Mary, what did you think of that story, the familial story?
Okay, so we had booked him thinking we were just going to talk about the anniversary of Jaws.
We sure did. And about his brother's writing.
And then through our research, uncovered layers of generational creative moxie.
Yes.
And Nat's own career.
For sure.
And that was just amazing, seeing how the generations wove together, the influences on Peter's writing from the experiences that he's had, the observational qualities. I love the story of Peter sitting down at 15 and being
1,000 words a day.
incentivized
Yes.
to write and discovering something about himself.
And the discipline it takes.
Yes. So and the fact that what started as a scary thriller turned into a cause for Peter, his wife, Wendy, and that's almost in ways been more impactful than the book in really important ways.
I think that, I shared with you and Nat, for example, that I was just recently at Universal Studios. There's Jaws everywhere. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the movie. I never saw the movie as a kid. It came out, I was born about 10 years later, but I am so aware of every part of that movie. I even met Roy Scheider at one point and knew exactly who he was, even though I'd never seen it. So I knew about that. And I think that is the impact that this story has had on 50 years of society, of the world, of our culture. One thing we didn't even get to talk about is the impact of, didn't you learn the lesson of Jaws? You see that I've read it in books, I've seen it in movies, TV shows, news reports about that part of the story about you mentioned a little bit tonight about the impact, economical impact of a community and making decisions. But there are so many different pieces of this story and the movie that have impacted our world. And I think the most amazing thing, learning more about Peter and hearing Nat talk about his work and Wendy's work, is the preservation and the education about not just sharks, but the oceans and the work that they've put in with that. Do you think we would have Shark Week every July if it weren't for what the Benchleys have done? I don't think so. I love watching Shark Week and learning about the sharks and seeing this footage and, hearing Nat speak about his brother's work and, all the dives he's done and the research, the work he did is phenomenal. And I think, in some fashion, whether it's direct or indirect, is pivotal to what we know today.
Well, yeah, it was a game changer. And I really respect that Peter and his wife, Wendy, could have sat back on their writing laurels
Yeah.
after Jaws was published, but they felt an ethical obligation to do some reverse PR on what
Right.
the shark was getting and have really impacted young people to pursue careers in shark conservation and affected policy changes. And I really respect that. So overall, I think it's safe to go back in the water.
For sure. And further than that, hearing Nat's oral history, as you dubbed it, because that's essentially what our conversation for this last hour has been, is an oral history of his family. I mean, I love history. I love autobiographies. This is, so fascinating on so many levels, just to hear about how generations and time and things happening in the world can affect the trajectory of not just one life, but generations.
Yeah, there's creative Moxie going way back in that family, just carving their own path, doing freelancing, taking projects that interest them. And I loved Nat's advice of don't have a fallback because then you have to commit.
Yeah.
So all in all, a great conversation.
Yes.
And do you want me to do the Jaws theme music to close us out?
I mean, you started with it. May as well. Till next time.
Till next time. This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Scenic Hudson and Thorin Designs.